Alright, so today I want to show you how you can control the amount of white in your pied ball python. Essentially what you can do is you can mix in certain genes and make a high white pied, or with other genes you can make a low white pied. And essentially what pied is, it's a recessive mutation. You actually need 2 copies of the gene for a visual, and it puts white patches all through your snake. And it was one of the very first morphs to hit the ball python market, and I think the pied ball python is really the gene that's responsible for the craze in ball pythons. As a matter of fact, I actually have a couple pieds in my collection, and when I'm actually pulling out snakes and showing them to people that really don't know anything about snakes, every time I pull out a pied, I always get the oohs and the ahs. They are so impressive. They are still really popular and in really high demand in the ball python industry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over the internet and I want to show you how you can control the amount of white in your pied ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here at Morphmarket.com, and this is what a pied ball python looks like. And at first glance you notice that it actually has a lot of white. We actually call this a high white pied. And if it has just a little bit of white, it's called a low white pied. And some people actually try to line breed. You know, I've actually seen some people starting with really high white pieds, breeding them together. In a lot of cases you'll actually get a whole clutch of really high white pieds, but it doesn't always work in all cases. I've actually seen people breed low white pieds together, and they kind of get a whole mix of low whites and high whites. And really, to dial it in and figure out if you want high whites or low whites, really what you need to do is you need to add certain genes to the mix, and you'll almost always be guaranteed a high white or a low white pied. And I kind of wanted to show you a low white pied, what that looks like compared to this one. This is a low white pied. Let me tell you, some of these can look completely different and be the same exact genes. It's pretty amazing. In a low white pied, you just have a little bit, and the kind of the interesting thing about the low white pieds is that it really jumbles up the pattern. Almost acts like, I'd say, almost like a leopard. A leopard kind of jumbles up the pattern, but the leopard kind of darkens it. In a low white pied, it doesn't really darken the background. It just really jumbles up the pattern. I actually have one more low white pied here. Take a look at this one. This is completely jumbled up. Just a little bit of pied right on the tail, just a little speck of white. And you actually have to know the genetics of this. So for example, if you actually took 2 pieds and bred it together and you hatched out a normal looking snake, that would be a low white pied like this one. You know it's a pied because both the parents were pied. And sometimes if you get a het pied, sometimes they can kind of fool you, but I'd say usually in your visual pieds, it would jumble up the pattern a lot more than just in a het pied. I'd say in a het pied, I've actually seen het pieds that have a little bit of white, sometimes a little ringer, but a lot of times they'll still keep the alien heads in the regular pattern of a normal ball python. And I wanted to show you what I think is pretty much the ultimate perfect pied, and that is this one. So all these are just standard pieds, all have the same genetics. And this one, you know, this pretty much as far as the visual appearance, I think this is pretty much the perfect pied, about a 50-50 mix with a broken up pattern where you have just a little bit here and there all through the snake. And it's kind of interesting, when I first started in ball pythons, the really high white pieds were selling for a lot more, and it seems like now that they've come down a little bit and are almost competing with kind of the 50-50. I think a lot of people are really shooting for the 50-50, and I'd say the low white pieds are usually a little more inexpensive than some of the other ones, I think, because they really don't have the kind of the pop that, you know, a lot of the other ones have, unless you really mix in other genes. So this is the Enchi ball python. The Enchi really reacts kind of unique with the pied. As a matter of fact, the Enchi, what it does is it reduces the pattern. It's a pattern reducing gene, and it also brings out a lot of the yellows and the oranges, sometimes just on the base Enchi, but a lot of times when you mix it in with other combos, you can see a big effect on the colors, the oranges and the yellows coming out. Here's what happens when you mix Enchi with a pied. You always get a low white pied ball python every time you mix Enchi in the mix. And Enchi's kind of interesting. A lot of times with the Enchi, you'll get a lot of the color right on top of the snake, and you get some of this white coming up along the belly, and sometimes you get a little ringer. And the other thing that's interesting about Enchi is it brings out a lot of the color, and it really seems like it scrambles up the pattern a little bit more. And if you're looking at low white pieds, let me tell you, Enchi is the way to go. It is pretty amazing. I kind of wanted to show you a couple Enchi combos, kind of before and after after you add the visual pied to the mix. And the first one I want to show you is this one. This is actually a banana, Enchi, orange dream, and yellow belly. And it's kind of interesting on this combo. The banana is so visually dominant, it almost completely masks all the other genes, especially like the orange dream and the yellow belly. And I've actually had banana, like coral glow pieds. Coral glow and banana are kind of the same thing. I've actually had the pastel coral glows, and you can't even see the pastel in there because it's just so visually dominant. And this is what happens if you mix this snake in with the visual pied. Take a look at this. This is the same exact genetics, except you have the visual pied in the mix. And it's kind of interesting, the combination between the pied and the Enchi is what's really scrambling up the pattern. And in this case, you can actually see the orange dream and the everything coming up, the banana and possibly yellow belly. Yellow belly is just, it really enhances the colors. I'm thinking that it probably has yellow belly because this is a really impressive snake. So here's another one I wanted to show you before and after we add the visual pied. This also has Enchi in the mix, so you'll also get a really scrambled up pattern and a really low white pied. And in some cases, I think the low white pieds with certain combos are absolutely stunning. It's kind of interesting, just the low white pieds usually sell for a lot less, and people kind of try to avoid them in some cases, but there's definitely some power when you mix them with the right combos. This is actually a super Enchi. So the super Enchi is twice as powerful as the Enchi. So the Enchi really gives you a really low white pied. The super Enchi almost gives you a 0 white pied in a lot of cases and really scrambles up the pattern. This also has pastel and ghost. Hypo is another name for ghost. And this is what happens if you actually take this snake and work pied into the mix. Take a look at this. And this is the reaction between the pied and the Enchi, the super Enchi, really bringing out all this crazy color and pattern. And since we have 2 copies of the Enchi, it's really taken the pied and reducing it to almost 0. You just have one little spot right down here. Really amazing combo. So this is the spider ball python. The spider is completely opposite of Enchi when it comes to working it into the pied. And essentially what the spider is, it almost looks like 3 or 4 genes. As a matter of fact, a lot of people say, how can I produce a spider ball python? And it's just one gene, believe it or not. It almost looks like, you know, it almost looks like calico and Enchi and all these different genes, but it's actually just one dominant gene. You take a spider, breed it to something else, and half the offspring come out as spider. This is what happens when you take spider and mix it in with a pied. You get a spider pied. Also, the nickname is Spied, and it's always an all-white snake with color. Usually has color just on the head of the snake. It's kind of interesting. And this is what happens. I kind of had this kind of a theory. What happens if you actually take the spider pied and work in Enchi into the mix? I was kind of curious about this. The 2 genes working together, the Enchi really reduces it all the way down to almost nothing, and then the spider gives you an all high white pied. This is what happens if you actually have a pied where you have the spider and the Enchi together. You actually get a snake that actually the spider wins out. The spider actually kind of overrides the Enchi, pushes all the color to the head. And this one actually has banana in the mix, so you can actually see the color of the head is the same as the banana, and the Enchi's kind of scrambling up the pattern on the head of the snake. Kind of awesome. So this is actually another spider pied. As a matter of fact, a lot of times if you actually take a spider, work it into pied, you get the spider pied with just color on the head. And I say the more kind of the spider pieds that are completely white that I've seen, it's pretty rare that you actually get them, but you actually still get them. As a matter of fact, I do have a spider pied in my collection, and this is actually called a white wedding. I'd say maybe every 3 or 4% of the time when you have a spider pied, instead of just color on the head, you get a completely white snake. It's kind of probably the ultimate high white pied that you can get with the spider pied. So here is the Panda Pied, really awesome. This is one of the most amazing combinations that I've ever seen. And this is actually the super black pastel in with the Pied. You can also do the same with the super cinnamon, which is kind of an interesting project too. And this is probably one of the ones that if you actually are shooting for the Panda Pieds, a lot of people have been leaving comments in the sections under my videos and say, hey, I'm going to shoot for a Panda Pied. And keep in mind that if you actually work the super black pastel into the Pied, you'll probably get a mostly white snake in a lot of cases. This is like the most color I've ever seen on a Panda Pied, and I'd say this is probably not even close to 50-50. As a matter of fact, I have another one over here. This is a Panda Pied. I'd say almost half of them over here on Morphmarket are completely white snakes, or they just have a little bit of black right on the tail, or maybe just a little bit of black on the head. So if you're shooting for the Panda Pied, keep in mind that it's actually a white, a really high white Pied when you're mixing in the super black pastel into the Pied. So here's another gene that will actually give you a really high white Pied in a lot of cases. This is actually the Russo Pied. And the Russo is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. As a matter of fact, a lot of people say that the Russo is also called the het leucistic. It was one of the very first genes in the blue-eyed leucistic. Come to find out, there's a whole bunch of genes in the blue-eyed leucistic where you can make an all-white snake with blue eyes. And if you actually mix Russo in with Pied, you always get a really high white Pied. As a matter of fact, I was searching all over Morphmarket, and this is the most color that I could find in a Russo Pied. Most of them just have a little bit of color right on the head, or maybe a little spot on the tail, almost similar to the Panda Pied. And I actually pulled up a picture over here. This is actually another Pinto Pied. In a lot of cases, you'll actually get a completely white snake. And I'd say it's kind of difficult because, you know, a lot of people don't really buy into the all white snakes for the, you know, the kind of the money that you're asking for in a lot of these cases. It's kind of a hard sell unless you really know what genes are in there and what the potential is when breeding it with other combos. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Fadhil Ramadan asks, can you have two supers in the same snake, like a super Enchi and a super Orange Dream? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, you can have two supers. You can have as many supers as you want in a snake, but you really can't have two supers that are compatible. So for example, you couldn't have like a super bamboo and a super lesser in the same snake, because you'd end up with a bamboo lesser, which acts like a super. And two genes is the most you can have on any like compatible gene or any one gene. So for example, you really couldn't have a triple pastel in one snake. The most you can actually have is two copies of the pastel gene, which is the super pastel, or one copy of the pastel would just be a regular pastel. It gets a little bit confusing. You really have to know which genes are compatible and which supers you can actually shoot for. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.